Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I want to talk about I want to continue my topic about World War II. Last time that we were on the program, we were not able to complete the entire World War II broad segment. And in this week's episode, I would like to discuss World War II starting from 1941, like right after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, all the way. I'm going to attempt to get it done by today. So bear with me, and we're going to begin. At this time in 1941, after the Germans were fighting the Soviet Union, Japan had an opportunity to attack the Soviet Union. And not only did Japan not attack the Soviet Union, they signed a neutrality pact in April of 1941, which at the same time allowed the Soviet Union not to worry about Japan, and Japan not to worry about the Soviet Union. So Japan ended up going south. Their main intention was economic, based upon oil, mostly on oil, and at the same time, they wanted to establish a great race in Asia. They wanted to establish the Great Eastern Asian Race. They were fighting China at the time, so Japan invaded French Indochina, taking advantage of the colonies in turmoil, particularly in France. Now, the United States was the only power at the time that could prevent Japan from stopping Japan's ambitions. So they set an embargo. So Japan responded with planning an attack on Pearl Harbor, and Japan ended up bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Japan ended up that day declaring war on the United States. In response, the United States declared war on Japan, along with Britain and other allies. Germany and Italy responded by declaring war on the United States. So, in fact, Germany indirectly was fighting a war on two fronts, something they did not want to do. They ended up fighting Britain, then they were fighting Britain on the Western Front, the Americans joined them, and then the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. But the Americans were also fighting a war on two fronts, with the Germans and the Italians in Europe, in Japan and Asia. So you're looking at, this is a true global world war. You have fighting in Europe, and you have fighting in Asia. So while Germany was fighting the Soviet Union, Germany was fighting on three fronts, because if you're counting Africa as a front, then you have, if you look at Germany was fighting a war on three fronts. They were fighting in Africa, they were fighting in Europe, and they were also fighting in Russia. So Germany was, in effect, having to put their men, they were overstretched. And the Soviet Union, in particular, in the Eastern Front, were very opportunistic. They took advantage of the numbers. Massive amounts of Soviet troops came pouring in to Germany, and one battle in particular, the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, arguably changed the tide. In Norman Davies' case, in his book, No Simple Victory, he said the Battle of Kursk changed the course of the war. Stalingrad was one of the most bloodiest events of the entire war. Millions and millions of Germans, of Axis powers, because it wasn't just Germans, but it was Italians, it was Romanians, Hungarians, and at the same time, it persuaded the Allies, it persuaded Hitler's allies, whom he viewed as corrupt, as contempt. He ended up viewing them very negatively following the disastrous defeat at Stalingrad. And it was a big morale to the German public. It was a very, very big morale to the German public. And at the same time, after Kursk, which was the biggest tank battle, this was months later, the Germans were in retreats the entire time as the Soviet Union kept advancing from the east. Now, what was going on in the West, the Americans and British, for the most part, they invaded the Americans wanted to directly go into France through the English Channel. The British, led by Churchill, thought differently. They wanted to go into Italy, called the soft underbelly of Europe. So Churchill persuaded Roosevelt that it would be wise to go through Africa, finish the African theater, then move up to Italy. So the Americans reluctantly agreed, and they went with the British into, at that time, Morocco, which was Operation Torch. They ended up invading Morocco. At that time, they were fighting Vichy French troops, not exactly German soldiers. So then they went into Germany. They went into Morocco, and then they were fighting the Germans as well in Tanzania. And also, at the same time, the British were fighting the Italians in El Alamein in Egypt, and were driving them through Libya. So the Desert Fox, Rommel. So then he ended up going up into Europe. Hitler called him up to fight in Europe, and as a result, the two fronts combined not too far near the Tanzanian border, and the Battle of Africa ended with an American-British victory, and it ended up going into Italy. At this point, Italy was already sick of fighting in the war. We're talking about 1943. The Italian people were sick of Mussolini. They wanted to overthrow Mussolini. The king disposed of Mussolini, sent him into a conference, and Mussolini was eventually sacked and arrested and was taken away, and a new government was replaced in Italy. Now the problem was Germany occupied Italy. Just like they occupied France not too long ago, they occupied Italy. And so now Germany had to expand their stretch into Europe, into Italy, and throughout 2 years there was massive fighting in Italy between the Americans and British invading from Sicily onto the south, and the Germans fighting in the north. So then, while the Soviets were fighting in the east, and there was another front within the Italian front, then came the Battle of Normandy. But when we come back, we're going to discuss the Battle of Japan, or during the island hopping campaign, here on History Now on ONTV.
The Orion Lighted Parade is a tradition that ushers in the holiday season here in the Orion area. Families line the streets in the village to enjoy this festive event, but it wouldn't be possible without the Holly Jolly Folly. This year's fundraiser is scheduled to take place on Friday, December 5th at Golling Buick GMC, located at 1491 South Lapeer Road. Enjoy live entertainment, a silent auction, a cash bar, and a 50-50 raffle. Food will be provided by Italia Gardens. Tickets are $35 per person and are available at Golling Buick GMC. For more information, call the Orion Area Parade Group at 248-802-5521 or visit orionlightedparade.org.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. At this time in 1941, when Japan had declared war on the United States, Japan had moved very quickly. They had intended to occupy the Philippines, which was an American colony. They were able to do so. They occupied Hong Kong. They had the move called the Bataan Death March, which they forced thousands of American troops on a death march in the Bataan Peninsula. And at the same time, they were also threatening Australia. They were invading in the West Guinea, in the West Guyana area. So they were threatening Australia, and by 1942, Japan was at the height of its power. It was going to take the Americans to stop the Japanese. And for the most part, the Americans were on their own against the Japanese. You could say the role of the British, but you could also say, but for the most part, as far as the dominant power, it was the Americans. Though Australia did play a role. I cannot deny Australia's role in the war in the Pacific because they did play a role, especially in the areas north of its area, particularly the Battle of the Coral Sea. The biggest momentum change in the war was it was in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which the Americans were able to stop the Japanese, particularly. And the thing was, it was expected to be a naval battle, but it ended up being an air battle over the Coral Sea. It was one of the biggest air wars in the entire war. And it was a result. It was a draw, but the Americans held firm. And at the same time, the Japanese slowly but surely began their tactical retreat, because one thing that's very important was the Americans had economic power. That's something that the Japanese did not, which was economic power, the ability to have more tanks, and at the same time, the impact economically started to impact Japan. So the other battle that impacted it was the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway, Japan attempted to invade Midway Island. However, the Americans hinted it was coming. They had broken the Japanese codes, and they ended up getting a decisive victory over the Japanese. And throughout that time, Japan was in retreat. We talked about island hopping. There were several fights over the islands in Japan. There was the Battle of Saipan. There was the Battle of particularly Iwo Jima, one of the most bloodiest wars in the entire war. The Americans marching on Mount Suribuchi. At that time, Japan was resorting to kamikaze fighters, they were considered suicide bombers over the American tanks, or over the American boats, not tanks, over the American boats. And that was intended to cause morale to the Americans in terms of how, in terms of fight a war. The Japanese, they viewed death as honor. They viewed it as at the time of fighting for their Emperor Hirohito, Emperor Showa, who would rule from 1925 to 1989. He ended up becoming he was the emperor at that time, and he was the wartime emperor at that time. Hideki Tojo was seen as the mastermind of the war, and he was forced out by Emperor Hirohito. He actually resigned from that, and as a result of the continuance of island hopping and fighting, the Americans were ending up near Japan itself. They had a bloody battle in Okinawa, and when we go over the end of World War II, I'm going to talk about the atomic bomb. I'm going to switch to Europe briefly because we want to talk about the Battle of Normandy, the largest seaborne invasion the largest American, British, Canadian armada. Now, Norman Davies says that the Poles did participate. Some did, but not to the extent that the Americans, the British, and Canadians did. So then they invaded mainland France through Normandy. A lot thought it was going to be through the Port of Calais, which was the easiest route from Britain to France, the shortest seaport through the English Channel. But Hitler was caught off guard. Hitler thought that it was going to be on Calais, didn't want to be bothered, so by the time the Germans were intending to fight, they were overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed with the Armada, and at the same time, Germany was losing men to the Soviet Union, to the Americans and British, and also even the coup of 1944, of the attempted coup, which was called Operation Valkyrie, which was the attempted plot by General von Stauffenberg and other other conspirators, other members in the German army attempted to take Hitler's life. So Hitler was very paranoid. At the same time, he was addicted to drugs, and it forced Hitler more and more into seclusion. Hitler refused to talk to his own people. And it was just a mess in Nazi Germany. There was mass panic. Most of the fear was towards the Soviet Union. And it was just pandemonium in Germany between 1943 to 1945. And at that point, there was bombs all over Berlin from the Americans, from the British, from the Soviets. And it was just complete disaster. And then the East, country after country fell. Romania, Bulgaria, the forced German soldiers to move from Greece. Then Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, all were victims of the Soviet occupation following in 1944. Not to mention Poland. Poland was also a victim of the Soviet occupation. The Warsaw Uprising in 1944. The Soviets encouraged the Poles to uprise against the Germans, but then would not aid the Poles, and instead allowed the Germans to crush the Polish uprising. But the only country that the Soviets could not seem to defeat was Finland. Though Finland had to sue for peace, the Soviet Union was not able to defeat Finland. And Finland was able to come out of the war pretty much unscathed, with Carl Gustav von Mannerheim being seen as a hero in Finland for his role in fighting the Soviet Union during both 1939 and in 1944. So now the Soviet Union is now advancing onto Berlin. Now you also got the Americans fighting the Japanese on Okinawa. We're going to discuss that on our final segment here on History Now on ONTV. Hello, Lake Orion and Oakland County. This is Anthony Taormina here, talking a new show here called OA Now. We're going to talk about sports from football to basketball to volleyball to track and field to soccer, cross country, etc. here on OA Now on ONTV. Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. Well, obviously we're talking about World War II and broad, and I'm continuing to go broad at this point. So any specific information, it's not going to be shared, but obviously I just want to give you, the viewer, a broad perspective of World War II. So bear with me. All right, at this point, the Germans are trapped in Berlin. There's Americans and British are threatening Germany from the west. The Soviet Union is threatening from the east. The Americans and British allow the Soviets to take Berlin. So there's massive fighting taking place in Berlin in March of 1945. And there is hand-to-hand combat fighting, and it's occurring everywhere. March and April of 1945. So on April 30th, Hitler takes his own life. Instead of fighting to the last man, which he wanted the German people to think he was fighting the last man. He didn't. He was a coward. He committed suicide. He died. So the Russians, basically the Soviets, the Russians advanced onto Berlin. They invaded it. And on May the 8th, the Germans surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II in Europe. Now, Germany and Austria as well, because it wasn't just Germany, was occupied into four spheres of influence, which was the American sphere, the British sphere, the Soviet sphere, and the French sphere. Also, the British had sphere as well. Same thing with Austria. Now, Berlin was in control of the Soviet sphere of influence, but also that city was also divided as well. So as a result, the World War II began the Cold War in Europe, but also in Asia too. But also there was a war to be won in Japan. The Americans and the Japanese were fighting a bloody war in Okinawa, and the Americans were very successful. and now they were in mainland Japan. The Soviet Union broke the neutrality pact with Japan and invaded Manchuria and the northern parts of Korea, while the Americans, knowing that they didn't want the Soviets to get too much involved in Asia, particularly in Japan, used 2 atomic bombs. They first bombed Hiroshima, and then they told the Japanese to surrender. The Japanese government refused. At that time, Japan's government was militaristic still. So they had a choice between war or peace. They chose war. Nagasaki got bombed. Then after that, another decision was made. Hirohito got involved, the emperor. He chose peace. Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 15th, 1945. He spoke for the first time to the nation of Japan, insisting that they surrender and accept the inevitable. The Americans under General Douglas MacArthur, who is widely seen as a hero in the Pacific, wanted the emperor to maintain his throne, feeling that the Japanese could cooperate under an American occupation, with him on board. So he wasn't tried for war crimes, unlike his other Japanese counterparts. They were tried and they were executed, including General Hideki Tojo. Now, with the Nazis, they were tried at Nuremberg. There was many, and many of them cheated the gallows. Himmler killed himself. Goebbels killed himself. Goering was a star witness at Nuremberg, but he, on the last second, took his own life. He took a drug, poisoned himself, killed himself. Von Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others, including Kaltenbrunner, all of them were hanged for their crimes. Now, my conclusion here is World War II began the Cold War between the United States and the West against the Soviet Union in the East. The Soviet Union occupied Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, until its collapse, until 1989, and then eventually the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. But also not just in Europe, but in Asia as well. There would be several proxy wars, such as the war in Korea, which still exists technically today between North Korea and South Korea. Also, we saw what happened in China, a communist government takeover in China, led by Mao Zedong. Then we saw Vietnam. Now, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, died in 1953. But as a result, the Cold War would continue until 1991, where, as I said, the proxy wars, Korea, but also Vietnam, which the Americans became dragged down into a war that couldn't win. So Americans had to ship their soldiers out, and massive protests occurred in the United States because of it. The Soviet Union experienced the same thing in 1989 in Afghanistan, or in 1979, which would last for about 10 years until the Soviet Union withdrew their troops from Afghanistan. But also we saw World War II begin, and we'll go over this lecture another time, the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews perished during the war, and thanks to the Nazi brutality. And as a result, the State of Israel was created in Jerusalem, and it has led to continued friction that exists to this day between the Israelis and the Palestinians, who are also fighting for that territory from 1945 onward. World War II caused a lot of current conflicts to occur today, and it still is there. Germany and Japan are actually the United States' two biggest allies, especially in terms of economics and economic growth. The United States helped both those countries reestablish themselves as world superpowers. Britain is still one of our strongest allies today. It's strange, but at the same time, World War II is still responsible for so many of the situations that are occurring abroad today. And it is also responsible for why the United States is one of the world's largest superpowers. The Soviet Union, same thing, until 1991. Russia is still trying to claim that superpower status, but they're not a superpower. The only world superpower is the United States of America. In that, I conclude this week's episode of History Now. Good night, Lake Orion. Have a great night. I hope you learned something. Good.